He fell. It wasn't a slow fall. It was 1 second, just 1 second of a poorly placed paw. And Koba, the oldest gorilla in the forest, plunged between the two cliffs as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. The impact shook the rocks. The birds burst into flight, and the silence that came after was too heavy to be normal. Koba was almost 40 years old. For a wild gorilla, that's a lifetime. His back carried scars from battles no one else remembered. His arms, which were once capable of bending branches as thick as trunks, now trembled from the impact of the fall. He was at the bottom of a crevice between the rocks, wedged from one side to the other, unable to move up or down. His breathing was short, rapid, and there was something in his eyes at that moment that wasn't just pain. It was the expression of a being who understands that he has reached a place with no way out. A few kilometers away, Davi was walking along the eastern trail of the reserve with a heavy backpack and a radio clipped to his belt. He had been a forest ranger for 11 years and knew every meter of that territory. He knew the name of every stream, the location of every group of animals, and the seasons of every plant that bloomed on the slope. But that day, what caught his attention was none of those familiar details. It was the silence. The forest is never completely silent. There are always insects, leaves, wind. When a noise disappears like that, suddenly it's because something has happened. Davi stopped. He raised his eyes to the line of cliffs in front of him. And then he heard it, low, almost inaudible, something between a groan and a muffled roar coming from within the rocks. He followed the sound for almost 20 minutes, avoiding roots and loose stones, until he reached the edge of the crevice. When he looked down, he froze. Koba was there, trapped, injured, and looking directly at him. At that moment, Davi felt the weight of a decision he didn't yet know he would have to make. But the forest had already chosen. It had placed both of them there at that point, at that hour, and there was no way to pretend he hadn't seen it. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and tell us in the comments what you think and which city or country you're watching from. Davi had encountered injured animals before. Snakes, tapirs, even a young jaguar once caught in barbed wire. But a gorilla was different. An injured adult gorilla is unpredictable in a way no training fully prepares you for. And Koba was not young. He was a male of nearly 200 kilos with teeth capable of breaking bone. Davi's first instinct was to step back, call for backup, wait until the next day with the team. But Koba didn't roar. He didn't bare his teeth. He made none of the typical movements a gorilla makes when it feels threatened. He just stayed there, breathing with difficulty, eyes fixed on the man above. There was something in that gaze that Davi couldn't name. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pure fear. It was almost as if the animal knew, in some way that science cannot explain, that that man was the only chance he had. Davi stepped away from the edge and grabbed the radio. He called the base 3 times in a row. Total silence. The signal in that part of the reserve had always been bad, and that day it was worse than ever. He looked up at the sky through the treetops. The sun was already dropping fast. In less than 2 hours, it would be almost impossible to see anything at the bottom of that crevice. That was when he noticed something that changed everything. On the side of the rock, about 3 meters below the edge, there was a ledge wide enough for a person to stand on safely. And on the opposite wall, there were regular fissures, almost like steps carved by erosion. Someone who knew what they were doing could climb down there, carefully, with enough rope and a willingness to take the risk. Davi had rope. He had basic equipment in his backpack. What he didn't have was any guarantee that he would come back from there in one piece. He stood still for a long time looking down. Koba remained motionless, breathing unevenly, his eyes still fixed on the man. and Davi thought of all the reasons not to go down. The real danger, the reserve protocol, simple common sense. He thought about all of it clearly, and then, without saying a single word, he began tying the rope to the nearest tree. It wasn't a loud or dramatic decision. It was silent, almost automatic, the kind of choice that defines a person not by what they say, but by what they do when no one is watching, when no one will know and nothing is forcing them. The descent was more difficult than Davi had calculated. The rock was damp, not from rain. It was the constant moisture of that enclosed crevice, where the sun never really reached and the still air left everything soaked with cold. Every step had to be tested carefully before taking weight. Every movement of the rope had to be controlled with both arms, because a slip there would be the end. Koba followed every inch of the descent with his eyes. The gorilla did not move. He made no sound. He only watched, with that quiet and dense attention that large animals have when they're evaluating something they do not yet understand. Davi knew very well that he needed to stay calm. Any sign of panic could change everything in a second. When his feet touched the rocky ledge, he took a deep breath and assessed the situation up close for the first time. Koba's left hind leg was trapped between two stones that had shifted with the impact of the fall. It wasn't a deep entrapment, but the angle was bad. Any sudden movement from the gorilla would put more strain on the joint. There was a long cut on his right shoulder, already clotted, and his breathing was still irregular, as if something in his ribs hurt with each deeper breath. Davi opened the backpack slowly. He took out the water bottle first. He didn't know if Koba would accept it. He extended the container with his arm outstretched, without moving his body forward, without looking directly into the animal's eyes, a sign of respect he had learned years earlier from a veterinarian who worked with primates. Koba sniffed the air. Then he sniffed the bottle, and then, with an almost careful slowness, he lowered his snout and drank. That moment froze time. Davi felt something tighten in his chest. It wasn't relief. It was too early for that. It was something else. It was the feeling of being inside something that has no easy name, a connection that crosses everything that separates man from animal and leaves only what is essential. Two living beings, one needing help and the other choosing to give it. Now came the hardest part. The stones needed to be moved without causing more harm to the leg. And Davi would have to do it with his own hands, just inches from a gorilla that was still in pain. He adjusted his position, closed his fingers around the first stone, and began. The first stone came loose with less resistance than he expected. The second did not. It was wedged at an angle that required lateral force, and the space was too small for Davi to use his whole body. He had to work with his forearms, pushing sideways, inch by inch. Koba felt the movement. A sound came from his throat, low, almost a warning. Davi stopped, waited, then continued, even more slowly. It took 40 minutes to finally free the leg. When a stone gave way and Koba pulled the limb back, Davi instinctively stepped back. It was the most dangerous moment. An animal in pain, newly freed, can react in ways that have no logic. But Koba did not lunge. He stayed still, testing the weight on the leg carefully, as if measuring his own body after a long absence. And then he turned his gaze to Davi. It was not the same look as before. Before, there had been desperation. Now, there was something else, something calmer, heavier with meaning. Davi couldn't explain it later when he tried to describe the moment to other rangers. He only said it felt like being recognized by someone you had never met before. The problem now was the climb up. Koba was injured. The leg could bear weight, but it trembled. The cut on his shoulder had opened again with the effort. Climbing the gorge wall alone, in that condition, would be impossible. Davi looked up, measured the height with his eyes, and made a decision that he himself considered absurd the moment he thought of it. He would climb up first and use the rope as lateral support for Koba. There was no other way. Davi climbed the wall using the fissures, pulling the rope behind him, and when he reached the top, he tied one end to a thick trunk. He threw the other end down and knelt at the edge, holding it with the weight of his own body. What happened next surprised even him. Koba looked at the rope, looked at Davi, and began to climb, not in a chaotic way, but with a methodical determination, using his arms more than the injured leg, bracing on the knot Davi had made at the right height almost by instinct. When Koba's enormous hands touched the edge and the gorilla pulled himself up on his solid ground, Davi felt his legs tremble. The two of them stood there, a few meters apart, just breathing. Koba left before nightfall. He moved away slowly, still favoring the leg, disappearing among the trees, as if the forest had swallowed him back. Davi stood at the edge of the gorge for a while, looking at the place where the gorilla had vanished, unable to move his feet. It took him a while to return to the base. When he arrived, he told no one. Some experiences lose something when they turn into words spoken to those who weren't there. The following months were normal. Patrols, reports, the routines of someone who works alone in the field. Davi continued walking the same path, passing by the same cliff, without finding any sign of Koba. Over time, he accepted that he might not see him again. Then, on a morning in the dry season, 7 months later, something stopped Davi in the middle of the trail. A smell, then a sound, then silence. That specific silence he had already learned to recognize. Koba was sitting less than 20 meters away, on top of a flat rock that caught the morning sun. He was different, larger, somehow, not in size but in presence. The leg had healed. The shoulder no longer showed the cut. And around him, a few meters away, there were 3 other younger gorillas, quiet, attentive. Davi did not move forward. He stayed where he was. Koba climbed down from the rock with deliberate slowness. He walked toward Davi until he stopped just a few steps away. He stayed there, breathing the air between them, looking at that man with the same intensity as on the day in the gorge, but without any of the shadows that had been in that gaze before. Then he slowly turned his back and went back to the others. Davi stood there for a long time after they all disappeared among the trees. He thought about everything he had risked that day, months earlier. He thought about how many times in life we come close to a moment like that and just pass by, without stopping, without going down, without extending a hand, without choosing the harder path. The forest keeps no record of anything. No signs, no documents. But sometimes it gives back what you gave in a way you didn't expect on a day that seemed ordinary. If this story touched you in any way, leave your comment below. Tell us which city or country you're watching from, like the video, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones.